In a secret weapons facility outside Pyongyang, North Korean engineers gathered around what they believed would be their greatest achievement, a perfect copy of America's M16 rifle, reverse-engineered from specimens captured in Vietnam. When the first prototype was test-fired, it exploded in the shooter's hands, sending shrapnel through his arm and exposing years of technical incompetence, desperate corner-cutting, and a totalitarian system where telling the truth about failures could mean death. This is the story of how the world's most isolated regime tried to steal American technology and failed spectacularly.
The Hermit Kingdom's ambition. By the early 1970s, North Korea under Kim Il-sung had transformed into one of the world's most repressive and isolated states. The Korean War had ended in stalemate 20 years earlier, leaving the peninsula divided and both sides heavily militarized. While South Korea aligned with the United States and began its path toward economic development, North Korea embraced the doctrine of self-reliance, called Hooche, that emphasized independence from foreign influence, while simultaneously depending heavily on Soviet and Chinese military aid. The North Korean military, officially the Korean People's Army, was massive. More than 700,000 active-duty personnel supported by millions of reserves and paramilitary forces. But size masked critical weaknesses. North Korean equipment was almost entirely Soviet or Chinese in origin, often outdated designs from the 1940s and 1950s. While Soviet client states in Europe received newer equipment, North Korea was a backwater that inherited cast-offs and obsolete weapons that more favored allies no longer wanted. The small arms situation exemplified these problems. North Korean infantry were armed primarily with Type 58 rifles, Chinese copies of the Soviet SKS, itself a design from the late 1940s. Some elite units had AK-47s or the newer AKM variant, but these were relatively scarce. North Korean factories produced domestic versions of these Soviet designs, but quality was inconsistent and production capacity limited. Senior Colonel Pak Min-chol, director of the 2nd Machine Industry Bureau responsible for small arms development, understood his country's weaknesses better than most. A veteran of the Korean War who had studied engineering in the Soviet Union during the 1950s, Pak had spent 2 decades trying to modernize North Korean weapons production with minimal resources and under constant political pressure to demonstrate superiority over the American imperialists and their South Korean puppets. The situation changed in 1968 when North Korea, which had been providing military advisors and support to North Vietnam, received several captured American M16 rifles from their Vietnamese allies. The rifles arrived in Pyongyang in early 1969, and Pak was ordered to examine them and determine whether North Korea could produce equivalent weapons. "Study these rifles carefully," the order from Kim Il-sung's military command stated. "The Americans use these weapons to kill our Vietnamese comrades. We must understand this technology and create superior weapons for the inevitable liberation of the South. You have 2 years to produce a North Korean rifle that surpasses American capabilities." Pak examined the M16 rifles with growing concern. The weapons were technologically sophisticated, incorporating design features, materials, and manufacturing processes that were foreign to North Korean industry. The aluminum receivers, the direct impingement gas system, the synthetic furniture, the chrome-plated barrels, every component represented technologies that North Korea had limited or no experience with. "This is going to be extremely difficult," Pak told his deputy, engineer Kim Song-nan, during their initial assessment. "We lack the metallurgical knowledge to produce these aluminum alloys. Our plastics industry cannot create materials like these synthetic stocks. We don't have chrome plating capabilities for rifle barrels. And that gas system, it's completely different from anything we've worked with. copying this rifle with our current capabilities is probably impossible. Kim, a younger engineer who had never studied abroad and whose technical education had been entirely within North Korea's limited system, looked troubled. "But we've been ordered to produce this rifle. What happens if we report that it cannot be done?" Both men understood the unspoken answer. In Kim Il-sung's North Korea, failure to achieve assigned objectives was often treated as political disloyalty rather than technical limitation. Engineers who reported that tasks were impossible could find themselves accused of defeatism, lack of revolutionary spirit, or sabotage. The consequences ranged from demotion to imprisonment to execution. "We'll do what we can," Pak said quietly. "We'll attempt to copy what we are able to copy and substitute North Korean alternatives where we cannot match American technology. Perhaps we can create something functional, even if it doesn't match American performance." It was a decision born of desperation and fear, a choice to attempt the impossible rather than admit defeat. That decision would lead to years of wasted effort, dangerous failures, and ultimately, a weapon so flawed that it endangered the soldiers who carried it more than any enemy they might face.
The impossible task. Pak assembled a team of North Korea's best weapons engineers and technicians, though best was relative in a country with limited technical education, no access to Western technical literature, and industrial capabilities that lagged decades behind the United States. The team began by completely disassembling the captured M16 rifles, documenting every component, measuring every dimension, and attempting to understand how the various systems functioned. The first challenge emerged immediately: materials analysis. The team needed to determine the exact composition of the aluminum alloys used in the receivers, the steel used in the barrel and bolt, the synthetic materials used for stocks and handguards. North Korea possessed basic spectroscopic analysis equipment, but it was crude by Western standards and couldn't definitively identify all the alloying elements or their precise proportions. The receiver appears to be an aluminum alloy with zinc, magnesium, and copper, reported the metallurgist, senior engineer Choi Sung-ho, after weeks of analysis. But I cannot determine the exact percentages, and there appear to be trace elements I cannot identify with our equipment. The heat treatment process used to give this alloy its strength characteristics is also unclear. We can approximate, but I cannot guarantee that aluminum produced in our facilities will have the same properties. The barrel presented different problems. It was constructed from high-grade ordnance steel, button-rifled to create the spiral grooves that spun the bullet, and chrome-plated on the interior to resist corrosion and extend barrel life. North Korean steel mills could produce ordnance-grade steel, though quality control was inconsistent. The rifling process could theoretically be replicated, though North Korean machine tools lacked the precision of American equipment. But chrome-plating rifle barrels was a technology North Korea simply didn't possess. "We can produce barrels without chrome lining," Choi suggested. "Soviet rifles don't have chrome-lined barrels, and they function adequately. The barrel life will be shorter, and corrosion will be more of a problem. But it should work." The direct impingement gas system posed perhaps the most significant technical challenge. Unlike traditional gas-operated rifles that used a piston, the M16 routed propellant gases directly into the bolt carrier to cycle the action. This system was lighter and simpler mechanically, but it required extremely tight tolerances and precise engineering. The gas port, a small hole in the barrel that tapped gases, had to be exactly the right diameter. Too small, and the rifle wouldn't cycle reliably. Too large and excessive gas pressure would cause accelerated wear and potential damage. The gas port is 0.8 millimeters in diameter, Kim Song-nam reported after careful measurement. "Our drilling equipment can produce holes of approximately that size, but our tolerances are plus or minus 0.15 millimeters. That variation will significantly affect how the rifle functions. Some rifles will be overgassed, some undergassed, and only a few will function properly. This tolerance problem extended throughout the design. The M16 was engineered with tight tolerances that ensured all components fit together precisely and functioned smoothly. North Korean manufacturing equipment, much of it decades old and poorly maintained, couldn't consistently maintain those tolerances. Parts would be slightly oversized or undersized, requiring hand-fitting during assembly, a time-consuming process that defeated the purpose of mass production. The ammunition presented yet another challenge. The M16 fired the 5.54 by 45 mm cartridge, which North Korea didn't produce. Creating a domestic version required developing new cartridge cases, bullets, propellant, and primers, essentially an entire ammunition production infrastructure. The cartridge's small caliber and high velocity required propellant that burned at specific rates to achieve proper ballistics. Get the propellant wrong, and pressures could be dangerously high or inadequately low. We can produce ammunition that looks like the American cartridge, but making it perform identically is beyond our current capabilities. We'll have to test extensively and accept that our ammunition won't match American performance. After 6 months of analysis and planning, Pak submitted his first progress report to military authorities. He carefully worded the document to acknowledge difficulties while expressing confidence that solutions could be found. He didn't explicitly state that the project was beyond North Korean capabilities, but he tried to convey the enormous challenges involved. The response was swift and threatening. The great leader has ordered that this rifle be produced. Your report suggests defeatism and lack of revolutionary consciousness. You will accelerate efforts and report success within 1 year, or face consequences for your failure. Pak understood the message. Success was mandatory, regardless of technical reality. He would have to produce something, even if that something was deeply flawed.
Compromises and corners cut. Work proceeded under impossible pressure. Political officers attached to the program monitored progress and reported regularly to military intelligence about the engineers' attitudes and commitment. Criticism of the project or suggestions that objectives were unattainable could trigger investigations into political reliability. Engineers learned to present optimistic reports regardless of technical realities, creating a culture where problems were hidden rather than solved. The rifle that emerged from this process was designated the Type 73, a weapon that superficially resembled the M16 but differed in almost every meaningful respect. The receiver was constructed from North Korean aluminum alloys that were significantly heavier and less strong than the American 7075 T6 aluminum. To compensate for the weaker material, the receiver walls had to be thicker, adding weight and making the rifle front-heavy and awkward to handle. The barrel was manufactured from North Korean steel without chrome lining, using rifling equipment that couldn't maintain the precise tolerances of American machinery. Barrel quality varied significantly from one rifle to another. Some were acceptable, others had rough bores that affected accuracy and accelerated wear. The direct impingement gas system was the source of the most serious problems. The gas port diameters varied widely due to inadequate machining precision. The bolt carrier group, which had to be manufactured to extremely tight tolerances, showed dimensional variations that affected reliability. The extractor, the small claw that gripped the cartridge rim and pulled the fired case from the chamber, was made from steel that was too soft, causing extractors to break or lose tension after limited use. The furniture, stock, handguards, and pistol grip was made from North Korean phenolic plastic that was brittle and prone to cracking. The material couldn't withstand impacts or temperature extremes without breaking, making the rifles fragile in field conditions. The ammunition was perhaps the weakest link. North Korean propellant chemistry was crude, producing powders that burned inconsistently. Chamber pressures varied significantly from cartridge to cartridge, with some generating dangerously high pressures while others produced inadequate pressures that prevented the rifle from cycling properly. Quality control was virtually non-existent.
Ammunition inspectors lacked the equipment and training to detect defective rounds, and production quotas took priority over quality. By late 1973, the first prototype rifles were ready for testing. Pak knew they were deeply flawed, but he had no choice but to proceed. Reporting that the rifles were unfit for testing would be admitting failure, with consequences he didn't want to contemplate.
The test that went wrong. The initial test firing took place at a military range outside Pyongyang in November 1973. A small group of officials, military officers, and engineers gathered to witness what was supposed to be a demonstration of North Korean technical capability and self-reliance. The rifles, freshly manufactured and carefully selected from the initial production run, were lined up for inspection before firing. Pak stood nervously as the chief political officer, Colonel Ri Young-ho, examined the weapons. "These rifles will demonstrate the technical superiority of our socialist system over the decadent American imperialists," Ri proclaimed. "The great leader's guidance has enabled us to not merely copy American weapons, but to improve upon them through revolutionary consciousness and scientific socialism." Pak said nothing, knowing that contradicting such political rhetoric was dangerous regardless of technical facts. He watched as 3 soldiers were selected to fire the rifles, single shots first, then short bursts, then sustained automatic fire to test reliability and durability. The first soldier loaded a magazine, chambered a round, and fired single shots at targets 100 meters downrange. The rifle functioned, though Pak noticed the bolt didn't lock back on the empty magazine as it should have. The second and third soldiers fired their rifles with similar results, functional but showing signs of problems. Extractors were leaving cartridge cases in chambers, requiring manual clearing. Magazines weren't seating properly, requiring forceful insertion. The weapons were working, but barely. "Proceed to automatic fire," ordered the range officer, a major who seemed oblivious to the problems Pak had noticed. The first soldier switched his selector to automatic and pressed the trigger. The rifle fired a 3-round burst, then stopped. He tried again, another burst, then silence. The rifle had jammed, the bolt locked forward on a case that had failed to extract. The soldier attempted to clear the malfunction, pulling back on the charging handle, but the case was stuck firmly in the chamber. The second soldier tried his rifle. It fired approximately 10 rounds in rapid succession, then there was a tremendous bang, and the soldier screamed, dropping the weapon and clutching his face. Blood poured from cuts where fragments of the bolt had lacerated his cheek and forehead. The rifle had experienced a catastrophic failure. Post-incident examination revealed that a cartridge had generated excessive chamber pressure, far beyond safe limits, causing the bolt to fail. The locking lugs had sheared off, and the bolt carrier had blown backward with tremendous force, sending fragments through the ejection port and into the shooter's face. The third soldier, seeing what had happened, refused to fire his rifle. He was immediately removed from the range and later disciplined for cowardice and lack of revolutionary spirit, though his refusal probably saved his life. The test was immediately suspended. The wounded soldier was evacuated to a hospital where surgeons spent hours removing metal fragments from his face. He would survive, but he lost sight in one eye and bore permanent scars. The rifles were impounded for investigation, and Pak was summoned to explain the failure.
The inevitable consequences. The investigation into the test failure was nominally technical, but actually political. Engineers examined the failed rifle and quickly identified multiple contributing factors: weak receiver material that couldn't contain the forces of firing, inconsistent ammunition generating wildly varying pressures, poor quality control allowing defective components into supposedly finished rifles, and inadequate design work throughout. But the political officers conducting the investigation weren't interested in technical explanations. They wanted to assign blame, preferably to individuals rather than systemic problems. Admitting that North Korea's industrial capabilities were inadequate would reflect poorly on the regime and its claims of technical self-sufficiency. Pak was accused of sabotage, deliberately designing a flawed weapon to embarrass the regime. The accusation was absurd. Pak had been trying to make the best of an impossible situation with inadequate resources and unrealistic demands. But in North Korea's political climate, technical failure was often reframed as deliberate sabotage by reactionary elements or foreign agents. "You deliberately created a dangerous weapon to injure our soldiers," the interrogator accused during one session. "You used inferior materials knowing they would fail. You sabotaged this project because of your bourgeois training in the Soviet Union and your sympathy for revisionist elements." Pak's protests that he had done his best with available resources, that he had repeatedly warned about technical challenges, and that political pressure had forced premature testing fell on deaf ears. He was convicted of sabotage in a closed military tribunal and sentenced to 15 years in a labor camp. His family was exiled to a remote rural area, effectively ending any possibility of his children receiving education or opportunities. Several other senior engineers on the project were also purged, though they received lighter sentences, 5 to 10 years of re-education through labor. The junior engineers and technicians were subjected to intensive political education sessions, where they were required to confess their participation in the sabotage and denounce their former supervisors. The Type 73 rifle project was officially canceled, and all prototypes were destroyed. The regime never publicly acknowledged the program's existence or failure. In official histories, the episode simply disappeared, becoming one of countless failures that North Korea's propaganda apparatus erased from the record.
The pattern of failure. The failed attempt to copy the M16 was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of North Korean technical failures, driven by the regime's toxic combination of unrealistic ambition, inadequate resources, and a political system that punished honesty while rewarding sycophancy. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, North Korea attempted numerous reverse engineering projects, trying to copy Soviet, Chinese, and captured Western equipment. Some achieved limited success, copies of Soviet tanks and artillery pieces that worked adequately, if not brilliantly. Others failed spectacularly, producing weapons that were dangerous to their own operators or simply non-functional. The fundamental problems were systemic and impossible to solve within North Korean political framework. The country's industrial base was inadequate for modern weapons production, lacking precision manufacturing equipment, advanced materials, and sophisticated quality control systems. The education system produced engineers with limited knowledge and no access to current Western technical literature. The political system made it dangerous to report problems honestly, ensuring that failures were hidden until they became catastrophic. The regime's ideology of self-reliance, juche, made the situation worse by limiting access to foreign technology and expertise. While other countries could license foreign designs, purchase manufacturing equipment, or hire foreign consultants, North Korea's extreme isolation meant it had to develop everything domestically. This might have been possible with sufficient time and resources, but North Korea had neither. The punishment of engineers like Pak created a culture of fear that stifled innovation and honest technical assessment. Engineers learned to tell superiors what they wanted to hear rather than technical truth. Problems were hidden until they became impossible to ignore. Failures were blamed on sabotage rather than systemic limitations, ensuring that the same mistakes would be repeated. North Korea's small arms situation remained problematic for decades. The country continued producing copies of Soviet and Chinese designs, but quality was consistently poor.
By the 1990s, as the Soviet Union collapsed and Chinese aid diminished, North Korea's military found itself increasingly armed with obsolete, poorly maintained equipment. Soldiers in elite units might have relatively modern AK-74 copies, but most infantry carried rifles that dated back to the 1950s or earlier. Defectors from the North Korean military consistently reported weapons problems: rifles that jammed frequently, ammunition that misfired or failed to fire, and equipment that broke under field conditions. A former North Korean soldier who defected in 2008 described his service rifle as a piece of junk that I wouldn't trust to fire when I needed it. Half the time the magazine wouldn't seat properly, the other half the rifle would jam after a few rounds. We were told these were the best rifles in the world, but we knew they were garbage.
The cost of isolation. The failed M16 copy attempt illustrated the broader costs of North Korea's isolation and totalitarian system. A country with North Korea's limited resources couldn't hope to match American technical capabilities through reverse engineering alone. Success would have required a systematic approach, investing in education and industrial development, acquiring foreign expertise and equipment, building manufacturing capabilities over time, and creating an environment where technical professionals could work effectively. But North Korea's political system made such an approach impossible. The regime's need for constant validation of its superiority meant that failures couldn't be acknowledged, learned from, or used to improve future efforts. Engineers who understood technical limitations were punished rather than listened to. Resources were wasted on impossible projects rather than invested in achievable improvements. And the cycle continued, generation after generation, leaving North Korea with a military that looked formidable on paper but was actually equipped with obsolete, unreliable weapons. The human cost was substantial. Pak Min-chol died in a labor camp in 1981, worked to death in mining operations under brutal conditions. His family remained stigmatized for decades. Other engineers purged during the Type 73 project faced similar fates. Countless soldiers were injured or killed by malfunctioning weapons over the years, victims of a system that prioritized propaganda over functionality. By the 21st century, as North Korea focused its limited resources on nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles, conventional military equipment deteriorated further. The infantry rifles that might have been replaced in the 1970s if the Type 73 program had succeeded continued in service, increasingly worn and unreliable. North Korean soldiers, already suffering from malnutrition due to the country's economic collapse, were armed with weapons that were often barely functional. The contrast with South Korea, which armed its military with modern weapons, including licensed production of American designs, was stark. South Korean soldiers carried K2 rifles, domestically produced weapons based on American technology but adapted for Korean conditions and manufactured to high standards. The weapons worked reliably, were well maintained, and were regularly upgraded as technology advanced.
The lessons ignored. The story of North Korea's failed M16 copy offers lessons about technology, politics, and the costs of totalitarian systems. Modern weapons are products of entire industrial ecosystems, not just individual factories, but networks of suppliers, research institutions, educational systems, and accumulated expertise developed over decades. Attempting to copy such weapons without replicating the underlying capabilities is nearly impossible. The M16, which North Korean engineers tried to copy, was the product of decades of American aerospace and firearms development. It incorporated aluminum alloys developed for aircraft construction, manufacturing processes refined through years of experience, quality control systems that ensured consistency, and design knowledge accumulated through continuous research and development. Simply measuring the dimensions and trying to replicate the shape captured none of this underlying knowledge and capability. But North Korea's political system made acknowledging these realities dangerous. Engineers were expected to achieve impossible objectives through revolutionary consciousness and dedication to the great leader.
technical limitations were treated as political failures rather than realistic assessments of capability, and the result was a cycle of failure, punishment, and repeated mistakes that continued for decades. Other developing nations that successfully adopted Western military technology did so through different approaches. South Korea, Taiwan, Israel, and others licensed designs, purchased manufacturing equipment, hired foreign consultants, and sent their engineers abroad for training. They built capabilities systematically over time, starting with simple licensed production and gradually developing indigenous design and manufacturing expertise. This process took decades, but ultimately produced capable domestic defense industries. North Korea's attempted shortcuts, trying to copy advanced weapons through reverse engineering alone, refusing foreign assistance due to ideological purity, punishing engineers who reported problems, guaranteed failure. The country's military, despite its size and the regime's bombastic claims, remained equipped with obsolete weapons that were increasingly unreliable and ineffective. The tragic irony is that North Korea possessed intelligent, dedicated engineers who might have succeeded given proper resources, realistic objectives, and a political environment where technical truth could be spoken without fear of imprisonment or death. Pak Min-chol was a capable engineer who understood the challenges his country faced. Given time, resources, and freedom to work systematically, he might have developed adequate weapons for North Korean forces. Instead, he was given impossible deadlines, inadequate resources, and political pressure that made honesty suicidal, then punished when the inevitable failure occurred.
The enduring legacy. Today, more than 50 years after the failed Type 73 program, North Korea remains one of the world's most isolated and technologically backward nations. Its military, while large, is equipped with weapons that would struggle against any modern force. The small arms that North Korean soldiers carry are often older than the soldiers themselves, poorly maintained and unreliable. The regime continues to produce propaganda claiming technical superiority and self-sufficiency, but reality tells a different story. Defectors report widespread equipment failures, inadequate supplies, and soldiers who understand that their weapons are inferior to those of potential enemies. The gap between propaganda and reality has become so wide that even North Korean soldiers, subjected to constant indoctrination, recognize the truth. The failed attempt to copy the M16 rifle remains largely unknown outside North Korea. The regime successfully suppressed the story, and few of those involved survived to tell it. But the pattern it exemplified, ambitious projects driven by political demands rather than technical reality, inadequate resources disguised by propaganda, failures blamed on individuals rather than systems, continues to define North Korean weapons development. As North Korea focuses on nuclear weapons and missiles, its conventional military continues to deteriorate. The rifles its soldiers carry, the tanks they crew, the aircraft they fly, all are obsolete and poorly maintained. The country has become a military museum, preserving weapons and tactics from the 1950s and 1960s not by choice, but because its isolated totalitarian system cannot produce anything better. The M16 rifle, which North Korean engineers tried unsuccessfully to copy, continues in service with American forces today in evolved forms, like the M4 carbine. It has been continuously improved through decades of development, benefiting from America's vast industrial base, sophisticated research institutions, and a military culture that values technical excellence and honest assessment of capabilities. The contrast between American success and North Korean failure in this domain
illustrates the broader gulf between open societies that value technical truth and closed regimes where politics trumps reality at every turn.